Good evening, everyone. My name is Francine Lafontaine. You've seen emails from me, most of you, over the last few weeks. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here to HEC Montréal, where I got my undergrad and master's degree, for that matter. Not in this building, though. It has another building that we used to live in. It's just really great to see you all tonight. We're going to get started with Michel Patry, who's the director of this very nice school, and I will just allow him to say a few words. Thank you.
Alors bonjour, bienvenue à Montréal, bienvenue à HEC Montréal. Welcome to all of you to HEC Montréal. Merci Francine pour ces paroles chaleureuses, ça fait plaisir de te retrouver. HEC Montréal is, of course, extremely proud to be hosting this 22nd annual meeting of the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics. We're doing this with our friends at Cyrano, and I recognize the president of Cyrano, Nathalie de Mercedes. So very, very pleased to do that with you. So again, we extend our warmest welcome to you all. This is summer in Montreal. So when there's no snow, it's summer. So we say we have 4 seasons, but it's more like a dichotomous. You have winter, summer. So enjoy it. I looked at the program. I'm an economist by training. I probably lost my competence over the last few years in a sense, but and my field is I/O, so I looked at the program very carefully. It's an outstanding program, and I was telling Francine, I'm really extremely impressed by the quality, the depth, the range of issues. It's a fantastic work that the executive committee of the conference has done, and I'm certain that you will agree with me that I should first congratulate them and thank them for putting together such a fantastic program. In particular, I'd like to thank the chair and president-elect and an alum of HEC, Francine Lafontaine, for the fantastic work you've done, so thanks a lot. Let me also recognize and extend our warmest welcome to 2 outstanding keynote speakers that will be with us and with you over the next few days. First, Monsieur Jean Tirole, Professor Tirole, who is the chairman of the Jean-Jacques Lafont Toulouse School of Economics Foundation. He's also the scientific director of the Institute for Industrial Economics, and as we all know, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2014. He is also the recipient of a doctorate honoris causa from the school at U of M in 2007, so we were before the Nobel Prize. And Mrs. Naomi Lamoureux, who is the Stanley B. Resort Professor of Economics and History at Yale University and Research Associate at the NBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research. So you have 2 outstanding keynote speakers. Allow me to say also a few words of thanks to the HEC team who collaborated with the Society to organize that conference, and my 2 esteemed colleagues who are there. So Decio and Nicolas, thanks a lot. Decio Coviello is a Canada Research Chair at HEC, an Associate Professor in the Department of Economics, as Nicolas Sahuguet is also in the Department of Applied Economics here at HEC. Again, as I said, the breadth and quality of the conference testify to the vitality of this field, to its dynamism, but also to its relevance, in particular to business schools, because this is a business school. So the next 60 seconds is the corporate part of it. Still, I hope you listen. So HEC Montréal was the first business school created in Canada. We go back to 1907. Today it's home to nearly 14,000 students and almost 300 faculty professors. But economics, this is what I want to stress, has played a big role in the history of the school, and from the start. When the school was created 111 years ago, there were only 4 departments. Economics and mathematics were 2 of those departments. So for the last century and more, economics has been central to what we're doing at HEC. Today, the Department of Applied Economics is one of 11 departments at the school. There are 28 professors, colleagues. I am one professor in this department, as are Decio and Nicolas. We have a lot of research chairs, research centers, but with an emphasis on macroeconomics, econometrics, and of course, industrial organization and institutional economics. So the connection not only with economics, but with IO and institutional economics is very important in our school. And my colleagues are leaders in those fields. We offer, of course, specialized programs both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And the department is also responsible for the publication of L'Actualité économique, one of the oldest scientific journals in Canada, in conjunction with the Société canadienne de sciences économiques. In conclusion, let me just say that for my colleagues, for all our colleagues at HSC and for myself, hosting this conference is a great honor. But more than that, it's an incredible opportunity to reinforce our commitment to research and teaching in economics and in institutional economics in particular. It's also an opportunity for us to learn and to become better at what we're doing. So once again, I welcome you at HSC. I hope that you will be coming back and visiting us as often as possible. I wish you a great stay in Montreal. And of course, a great conference. This I have no doubt just looking at the program. So all the best in the coming days. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michel, for these nice welcoming words and for looking over the program. And I'm sorry that you're not able to join us more during the sessions in the next couple of days. So yes, my next task is to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome Jean Tirole as the first keynote speaker to CEO 2018. Michel has already mentioned that Jean is the chairman of the Jean-Jacques Lafont Toulouse School of Economics Foundation, and he directs the Institute for Industrial Economics. He's also affiliated with MIT, where he holds a visiting position, and I've had the pleasure to bump into him when hanging around in Cambridge, where my daughter is also studying. And he also holds an appointment, is affiliated with the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, l'Institut de France, et the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, which he co-founded in 2011. Jean's PhD is from MIT, but he did that after completing studies in engineering at École Polytechnique in Paris and at École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, also in Paris, and obtaining a doctorat de troisième cycle in decision mathematics from the University of Paris 9. Jean holds a number of honorary doctorates from several well-known institutions. I am not going to make the full list, but I will confirm that one of them is from this institution where we are sitting today. He's also received many very important prizes and important distinctions, including, of course, the Svedrich, I'm not quite sure I pronounced that correctly, Riksbank Prize in Economics, so the Nobel Prize, basically. As most of you here know, his research has been mostly focused on industrial organization, regulation, finance, macroeconomics and banking, and some psychology-based work as well, economics as well. He's published a lot. And has many books, some of which are very popular as well and have been used throughout most of our studies for most of us here. So please join me in welcoming Jean Tirole to the podium, who's going to be talking to us about narratives, imperatives, and moral reasoning. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Francine, for those very kind words. And I didn't know what you meant by a lot, but it was very nice. And it's a double pleasure to be here. It's of course an honor to be giving this keynote lecture. The themes of the society are very dear to me, of course, and also to my institutions, both the Toulouse School of Economics and the Institute for Advanced Study, which is a pluridisciplinary institute, which, as Francine said, started in 2011, 2012. I also looked at the program like Michel, actually, and I was very, very impressed, not surprised, but impressed by the quality of the papers which are going to be presented. So, really, it's a great conference. Thanks so much. And of course, it's a pleasure to be back at HEC Montreal. So thanks so much. I'm going to give a talk about a paper joint with Roland Bénabou and Armin Falk about moral arguments. And that starts with a question about what is a moral thing to do. I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to notice that appeals to notions of right and wrong pervade the social and political discourse, and for right or the wrong reason, they often trump any argument of economic efficiency. I hesitated before putting a capital letter in the verb, but let's say there are two kinds of moral arguments. One is narratives, which basically provide reasons for what one ought to do, some kind of positive narratives that encourage you to work toward the common good, or on the contrary, justification for behaving selfishly, which can be called negative narratives or excuses. Narrative, by the way, is a little bit narrow. We are going to give a relatively narrow meaning of narrative. There is another meaning of narrative, which is making sense. Providing some meaning to our life, putting some order into our life, which I'm not going to talk about. At the other end of the spectrum are imperatives, which are kind of broad prescription dictating a fixed behavior without emphasizing why. Okay? Now, what we're going to look at is how these combine with social preferences, self-control, image or identity concerns to shape behaviors and favor the emergence of pro-social and anti-social norms. So let me start with narratives. The narratives may be hard information, or at least they will act like hard information. I want to be cautious about this. The important feature of narratives is that they have the potential to alter beliefs and therefore behavior. All that matters is that there is some kind of perceived grain of truth. And actually, so something that's going to persuade you to change your behavior in some way. That's the right definition of a narrative. And actually, if you think about it, some of the most successful narratives are wrong. Think about negative ethnic or gender stereotypes. But they can be very effective at the same time. Or maybe they're correct, but they're not the end of the story. So if they are taken like this, they lead you to mistaken conclusions. So for example, you may see, this year's winter was very cold, and therefore global warming is not really there. Or an anecdote, I have a friend who, that happens to him or to her. We also know that vivid life experiences actually have a lot of impact on our behavior, much more so than statistics. And we all know that actually we suffer from various cognitive biases. And one of the best narratives that politicians use all the time is a correlation. And because most of us actually are confused between correlation and causality, of course. So you give a correlation, the correlation may be quite correct, but in the end, we draw the conclusion when we should not. Motivated reasoning, basic neglect, and so on. All kinds of cognitive biases that many of you in this room are interested in. Now, this is going to give rise to moral standard, where moral standard will be the extent to which a society requires or tolerates excuses for selfish behavior. Now, at the other end of the spectrum of the persuasiveness spectrum is an imperative. So imperative is some kind of soft message. You shall not do that, okay? Without explaining why, you know. Or you can also say just because it's wrong or because I said so, but it's not really an explanation. It's basically something that specifies an action as opposed to trying to justify an action, okay? And in general, most of the moral reasoning is built around a combination of narratives and imperatives, and we'll try to see how. The paper builds on a workhorse model, which is completely utilitarian and consequentialist. So it's going to be very mainstream in that respect, mainstream economics, I should say. But that's going to account for many irregularities on the role of self and social image on moral behavior. Also for some Kantian behavior, I will mention that later on. And we are going to study things like the virality of narratives. We won't have time to talk about search for reasons to act or not to act. And we'll talk about the horse race between narratives and imperatives as means of moral influence. I'm not going to review the literature. It's clear that we built on several literature. Of course, the literature on pro-social behavior and moral identity. The literature on learning in new networks, because if we talk about virality, of course, that has something to do with learning in networks. The literature on cultural transmission. I should say that the most closely rated paper is an independent and simultaneous paper by Forster and van der Velde, which they are finishing now, and which is a very interesting paper, which I will recommend. There are a number of differences between the two. Now, what is morality? I'm sure you want to know what morality is about, right? I'm going to warn you, we're going to take a very, very narrow view of morality. It's going to be an economist view. Apologies for those of you who are not economists, but it's basically going to be an externality based, do no harm, right? So basically, it's not going to be crucial, by the way, for the positive analysis. If we just want to describe what's going to happen, it's okay. If we want to be normative, that's a bit different, of course, and it's going to have a normative flavor as well. It's a number of philosophers actually share this view, which is often the view of economists. You know, moral behavior is not to have negative externalities onto others. A number of philosophers have the same view, but as Jonathan Haidt points out in a recent book, well, not that recent, but you know, in this book, The Writer's Mind, lots of people have a broader view of morality. Maybe it's not something we agree with, and probably more fragile as well. So, for example, among those, there are a number of values which are based on disgust, tradition, etiquette, respect for authority, group belonging, loyalty. And partly we economists, we often feel uneasy about that because that leads to the condemnation of various things, like acts which have no victim, like gay marriage or life insurance in the past was thought of as being immoral, or paying interest on savings or whatever. All kinds of things where you ask, where is the victim, right? Why do you impose your value onto others if there is no externality? Now, we could debate what exactly is an externality. And same thing, there is Banfield's distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, which is, you know, roughly the in-group versus the broader society. So what is your moral duty? Is that moral duty to the member of the society, or do you take macroeconomists as well? Or, you know, I don't know. I mean, you know, what is your moral duty? I don't know. I love macroeconomists. I do macroeconomics myself, by the way. I just want to say. Just a little digression, because lots of people have written books on why economists actually fail to consider moral behavior. And in my recent book, Economics for the Common Good, I take issue with that. It's true that sometimes we're uneasy about certain things, but lots of our tools, in particular having to do with externality and market failure, they actually go a very long way towards thinking about morality. And this is really a digression, but lots of people will tell you, economists, they will think that we should sell baby for adoption, for example. There should be an auction. And that will not come to the mind of people in this room, because you say there's an externality on the third party who is quite important, it's a baby, right? Things like that, the child labor, slavery, it's just like, come on. But I think we have to enlarge our view a little bit. So, for example, if you think about this strange game of dwarf tossing, people enjoy seeing that, you have seen that. Actually, there was a Supreme Court decision in France only 20 years ago about that. There were also decisions in the US about that, with often the little person defending his right to actually have a job. And then the other saying, we have the right to watch because we enjoy it. The issue was not dangerous. It was not dangerous because you are padded and it's pretty non-dangerous actually. But the Supreme Court in France actually talked about the image externality on other people, what this means for the representation of little people. And some of that also applies. It's not the only reason why we feel uncomfortable about it, but that also applies for prostitution, especially women prostitution, in terms of image concerns about how we see society. Of course, there are lots of things we talk about, asymmetric information, market power. Again, lots of people will say economists believe that you should sell friendship. And we economists will say, no, that doesn't make any sense. There is adverse selection. If you buy friendship, how will you know that this person is your friend? It's just like, come on. It's just that the kind of thing that a little bit of thinking about standard market power and asymmetric information and the like. We also know a lot about internalities nowadays. We've ignored them for almost a century, but they have made a comeback a while ago. Things which have to do with self-control, which are very important, I think, to explain things like our reluctance to allow voluntary slavery or organ sales, maybe. Or, and sometimes you have a mixture of internalities and externality, like doping in sports and so on. And there are some interesting things to be said also about our motivated beliefs and what we want to believe about society and how it has an impact on our moral views. Now, that doesn't mean that we are totally comfortable with morality in general, but lots of things that people think economists don't take into account actually are taken into account by standard theory, and I would like to just mention that, and if you want to know more, you look at the chapter in my book. Now, let me discuss the basic model with Roland and Armin. So, it builds on earlier work that I've done with Roland, and Tirole also has done some work along those lines, which emphasizes a lot image concerns. Basically, some kind of signaling about who we are, right? So it's going to be a very Mickey Mouse version of the broader model, in which an individual may engage in moral or pro-social behavior. So can choose an action A equals 1. A equals 1 means that you behave pro-socially, or you choose A equals 0, which means that you behave immorally. Okay? There's a cost. If there were no cost to behave pro-socially, there would be no issue, right? There's a cost C, which is positive. For a reason you're going to understand in a minute, we allow hyperbolicity. So we allow for a self-control problem. So this cost is perceived above C, C over beta, where beta is less 1. So a standard hyperbolic framework. If you don't like it, beta equals 1 will be fine for almost everything, but it's useful for something to actually introduce some self-control parameter, and there is a fair amount of evidence actually that self-control plays a role in moral choices. So, the individual has some deep value. So basically there will be, just like in all those models, there will be 3 incentives to choose the pro-social or the anti-social action. One is one intrinsic values, intrinsic motivation, and that will be those deep values. How much do we care, how generous we are with regard to others. So that will be V. There will be the incentive, the extrinsic incentive, which is C, or C perceived C over beta, and there will be an image concern. Okay? So from that point of view, it's a very standard way of formalizing things. And image concern, it must be clear that it's not, that actually you don't know what the type of the agent is. So it can be VH or VL. So VH is a very small person, VL is a less small person, and the probabilities are rho and 1 minus rho. So. And the prior mean for future use will be a V bar. So that will be the expected V when you don't have any information about the action. Okay? Or more generally, when you don't have any, when the action doesn't convey any information. Now, the perceived magnitude of the externality will be called E. Between, say, 0 and 1, it doesn't matter. So, for example, the externality could be 0 or 1, and E could be the probability that there is an externality, or it could be the intensity of the externality, whatever. So there is an externality E, and that's going to be. But very importantly, we're going to take a very consequentialist utilitarian model. So basically, if it's more important to me, I will care more about it. If the externality is bigger, I will care more about it. Okay, that sounds reasonable. Okay, hopefully. Okay. So we are going to pick parameter, and nothing depends on that, but I don't want to accumulate different cases. So we're going to pick parameters under which the low type, the immoral type, the type VL, never contributes. So VL, in the next 45 minutes is going to be choose A equals 0. It's going to be a dominated strategy for type VL to actually contribute and behave morally. Again, doesn't matter. It's just one case, but the other cases give you the same thing. And so the question will be, does the I type contribute? And that will depend on the incentive. So the I type, what is the motivation of the I type? It's the intrinsic motivation, which is going to be proportional to the perceived externality, minus the cost of behaving well, which will be magnified by 1 over beta, times A if you choose A equals 1, or 0 if you choose A equals 0. And then you have mu, which is going to be the intensity of image concern, times VA hat, where V hat of A, where V hat of A is the posterior beliefs about V conditional on the choice of action A. So if you behave nicely, then the posterior beliefs will be higher. If you misbehave and you choose A equals 0, then you will get a lower posterior in general. Okay? So you care about your posterior beliefs, and it's reduced form. You could think about different stories for that. It could just be some kind of consumption of image consumption, or it could be more functional in terms of finding friends and mates and so on, whatever, or colleagues. Because of course someone who is more moral and more social is going to be more successful socially, hopefully. Okay? So that's going to be the total utility, intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and image concern. Okay? Now you have similar utility for the low type, but as I said, for the low type will choose A equals 0 anyway. Okay? So I think I've described pretty much everything. It turns out that there may be, for that particular specification, there may be a region where you have multiple equilibria. And you can understand that in the sense that if the I type doesn't contribute, then there's less stigma to not contributing, and that makes it more likely that the I type doesn't contribute. So there is a region where you have multiple equilibria, but then we select the Pareto dominant one. You can select the other one, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change. But you need a selection in order to predict something. So You can take the selection you like, but it gives the same result. Okay? Okay, so here is a very simple equation, and I will ask you to remember this equation. So will the oops, you're not going to, you remember it? Okay, so is the I-type going to behave prosocially? It's going to choose AH equals 1. Okay, so if it does so, he's going to get VH times E. Then he has to incur the cost of behaving well, C over beta. And then he's going to have reputation mu VH because the low type is never going to behave well because it's dominated strategy. So if you see someone behaving well by the elimination of strictly dominated strategy, you have to infer it's a high type. Okay? Now, this condition basically tells you that for the cutoff E equals C star, the I-type is indifferent between staying in an equilibrium where there is pooling at A equals 0 and signaling that is a I-type by choosing A equals 1. In a pooling equilibrium in which everybody misbehaves, then the action A equals 0 doesn't lead to any inference, and therefore the posterior beliefs is equal to V bar. Now, if you behave well, then you're going to signal your I-type, and therefore you'll get reputation VH for being your I-type. You'll have separated from the low type. It's just a span signaling model of some kind. I mean, nothing more than that, but it's very powerful. I mean, just this simple equation. So basically, good behavior is going to happen if the expected externality is greater than this threshold, E star. And if it's below that threshold, then you get a pooling equilibrium at A equals 0. Okay? And it turns out that even this simple model gives you something which is which corresponds pretty well with empirical evidence. So, for example, there is more prosocial behavior if you have high image concerns. So if mu goes up, sorry, I'm doing it the reverse, but if mu goes up, if you have more image concern, then you are going to behave better. Now, lots of people have run tests of that. So one thing is that you can increase the visibility to others. I have many experiments like that in the field and in the lab, in which instead of having just self-signaling is when you signal to yourself. Social signaling is when you signal to others. And there's a lot of evidence that I will behave much better if you are watching me than just by myself. For example, that's a very typical experiment. But also, you can manipulate self-awareness. So, for example, Armin Falk has an experiment in which, the standard experiment in the lab is actually pure self-signaling, because nobody knows what you have done in practice. You play a dictator game or ultimatum game or whatever, a trust game, and you click, but nobody knows what you have done. Just yourself. You're the only spectator. The internal spectator of Adam Smith, right? So you have your self-reputation, and that's the only thing at stake. But what Armin does is, at the moment when you click on the computer, A equals 0 or A equals 1, then you have the picture of yourself showing in front of you. So basically, you see your own picture on the computer before clicking. And that, of course, increases your self-awareness and increases your self-reputation concern, and that increases prosocial behavior. Okay. Self-control has been shown also to increase prosocial behavior. So people who have more self-control, for example, measure exogenously, tend to behave more prosocially. Or you can run experiments with the same person but in different conditions. So psychologists are very good at depleting your willpower. There are various ways of doing that. Or neuroscientists also can do that by inhibiting some region in the prefrontal cortex. And that reduces your willpower, so that lowers your beta, and that lowers prosocial behavior, exactly like in the model. There are also evidence of that the low cost of moral behavior is going to make you more prosocial, or high cost of moral behavior is going to make you less prosocial, and that's obvious. It's easy you just change the price, right? of course, if that's something which is more important, you perceive to be more important. So if you are told you give to a charity and the override is 25%, you're less likely to give to the charity than if the override is 5%, right? Or if you are told that your choice will matter with probability 10%, then that's different. Okay, there's one conclusion which is not robust to the assumption I made that only the I type can contribute. The parameters are such that that's this one. So in this one, basically, if you start with a good initial reputation, a high V bar, then you behave less well. So E star increases. And there's some evidence of that. That's called moral licensing. So, for example, if you have voted for Obama, then you are more likely to favor. If you have a chance actually to declare that you did vote for Obama, you have a higher chance actually of favoring a white over a black person in an appointment, that kind of thing. But there's also the reverse evidence, which is more cleansing. So when your reputation is very low, you have an incentive actually to rebuild your reputation possibly. And actually, we had a paper on identity with Roland where we showed in general the reputational incentive is some shape in V bar. So both empirically and theoretically, this conclusion is not robust. You have to put more into the model or into the empirical evidence to see. The other thing that this model delivers very quickly is that there's a trade-off in terms of whether behavior is moral enough from your own point of view. And there are two factors which go in opposite direction. The first is beta, that's where the self-control matters. So if I'm impulsive, I'm going to take decisions which I will regret, okay? Or I will not want to take ex ante. And that includes moral decisions. So for example, you come to me after the talk and you tell me, I don't like your paper. And then I start yelling at you. It feels good, right? It feels good, except that you won't like me anymore. So in the long term, that won't be as nice, right? And this is something we face every day, in our family, with our friends and so on. There's always this tendency to let off steam and say things that we will not want to say because we are impulsive. So from that point of view, there's this excess incentive to behave immorally in a sense, because of course there is a negative externality on the other party. But there is another factor which goes in the opposite direction, which is that image concern is a zero-sum game. So it's a positional good, image is a positional good. And in a sense, just like any signaling model, we actually lose, just like in Spence actually, we actually lose from being forced to signal. And there is actually a lot of evidence that sometimes people avoid the ask. There are lots of papers showing how people try to avoid the big R or try to avoid charity or whatever. And there are lots of papers which are fascinating on moral rigor room, which I recommend if you have not read them. So far, there is no narrative, but you can add a narrative. So narrative, there are going to be two types of narrative. One is an excuse or a negative narrative is something that gives you an argument actually not to behave morally. And we know lots of them. You downplay the externality, E. So the third party is undeserving. And of course, we know some dramatic examples with the Nazi propaganda and language degrading Jews, but there are many other examples, of course. A low probability of being pivotal, which is also downplaying the externality. So if I don't do it, somebody else will, okay? By the way, it's very consequentialist, right? It's very it's both an excuse, but in a sense, it also has some consequentialist reasoning. In a sense, I take into account the probability of my action changing the outcome. Magnification of the cost. So the Nazis, of course, in Nuremberg were all saying I was following orders. Or maybe I was pursuing another public good. Maybe I did something bad, but I was probably, we may not agree with that, but they were looking for excuses in that way. And by the way, it sheds some lights also on omission versus commission. For us economists, we always think that lying by omission and lying by commission is exactly the same because if it has the same consequence. Most people don't. And actually, if you ask people, is that as bad to lie by commission as to by omission than to lie by commission? They say no. And one of the things is that if you lie by omission, you have an excuse. You may have forgotten. You may have been in a hurry. You have an excuse. If you lie and you construct a wrong story, the excuse is not there, right? So the excuse actually can explain the difference between lying by omission and lying by commission. The positive narrative is a reverse. It actually pushes you toward A=1. A fairy tale, a role model, moral precept, religion, whatever. And most movies are about that. They end well. And actually, the happy ending is about telling you, look, if you behave well, in the end, only in the end, of course, otherwise that would be boring, but only in the end, actually it will be good for you, right? So that's part of the thing. It's not very interesting to consider exogenous narratives, but we have to do that in the first place. So imagine, for example, you start with a prior mean E0 for the externality. So it's going to be a narrative about E, about the externality, but it could be a narrative about C, it could be a narrative about other things as well. So imagine, for example, that you have a probability distribution f of E with density f of E on 0, 1, for example, and the prior mean is E0. So if E0 is greater than E star, that means that if you don't have any further information, you will actually the model type H, VH will actually choose A=1. So a negative narrative will be a reason not to act, which is going to convince you actually not to behave morally. And so it's something which is represented here. You start with a situation in which you will behave morally because you are beyond E star, but with a negative narrative, you go on the other side of E star. And conversely, a positive narrative, you start with a situation where you will not behave morally because your prior on the externality is low, but it's going to actually push you toward behaving well. Okay? So that's kind of straightforward. Now, what we're going to be interested in is the virality of narrative in the first step. So until should I behave morally or? You have a choice. I was looking for an excuse, Francine. Okay. Where is your loyalty, by the way? Okay. So I'm just going to give you the rough flavor of what we do. So narrative, by definition, they get narrated. They passed on from one person to the next. So the kind of thing we have in mind, so what we want to see is how fast and how far those narratives are spread. So for example, intersex relations, for example, in the workplace. So some people will think some behavior is in occurs flirting, some people will think it's harassment, and some people will care about it and some people will care less. So there are more moral people and less moral people, right? How is it experienced? So, there is a double uncertainty, both about how serious the offense is, and there is uncertainty also about how moral the man is, for example, okay? So there will be a probability X that the seriousness is relayed by the media, for example, or passed on between people. Also, that will be endogenous, passed on between people. That will be an example. So what is the moral duty, what is the moral standard in this population, and what kind of narratives will be passed on in the population. But you can apply this, so for example, to, say, a dominant national group, treating ethnic minority or immigrants, or you could think about redistribution toward the poor, where we know narratives, much more than economics, are actually central to the debate. So basically, if you redistribute toward the poor, is it going to help, in particular, the children and so on? Is it going to make a difference to their health and their education? Or if you take the reverse narrative, which is a negative narrative which pushes you toward more selfishness, you can always say it's going to be captured by the government or the NGO bureaucracy, or maybe it will be wasted by the recipients on drugs and alcohol and induce welfare dependency. So you see those are examples of narratives that are circulated and actually dominate the debate, the political debate. Okay? Okay. So there are two effects of passing on narratives. The first is a reputation effect. So if I misbehave, I want to find an excuse, basically, so that my reputation doesn't suffer too much. So I'm looking for excuses, right? And therefore, I will pass on negative narratives. At the same time, I may also have influence concerns. So if I give you a negative narrative, so I basically say it's okay to do it, not to do it, and to misbehave, then I may be worried that actually you are going to use this excuse and you are going to pass it on. So there will be some virality in it, and there is an influence concern. So intuitively, when reputation concerns are paramount, negative narratives will be likely to be shared more than positive narratives. If influence concerns are paramount, then positive narratives are more likely to be shared. Now, we are going to look at a specific network, which is already interesting. It's a very, very simple network. Anyone who works on network theory will find this ridiculous, but you know, it's already gives you a lot of insight. So imagine that it's going to be an infinite chain of people. And agent I will learn E exogenously with priority X. So E is uncertain. So basically, actually, we are going to, in a minute, we are going to say it's going to be low or high, but E is uncertain, and you may learn the level of externality in exogenously with priority X. You are going to learn the behavior, you are going to learn the behavior of your predecessors, I-1. If I-1 belongs to A means that you are active, so you have a choice to be made, or at least that your choice is observed. I will come back to that. Then, if you yourself are active and you have a choice to make, you're going to choose your action AI, which will be observed by the next person, and the next person is your audience, is the person you're trying to impress. And you're trying to buy social image from that person. Okay? But there is a disclosure decision, so that's where we make the spreading of narrative endogenous. So I-1 can disclose the narrative to I, if I-1 knows the narrative, of course, and I, again, if I knows the narrative, then he can disclose it to I+1. So there are two ways in which you can learn the narrative. One is just exogenously, or it can be relayed by other people. Okay. So there are two kinds of people. There are principal passive people or agents active people. And there is a Markov transition matrix between the two. So if you are active, for example, there is priority lambda that I+1 is active, and 1 with lambda that the other one is passive. Passive, by the way, means that either you don't have an action to take, or you have an action to take, but it's not observed. So you have no reputation concern. Okay? At least no social reputation concern. Lambda can be anywhere between 0 and 1. Lambda equals 1 means that it's a totally homogeneous group. I will come back to the interpretation. So I mean, think about this group as being only men. Only men, that's their social network. And P will be women. Okay, lambda equals 1, so the men stay with men, the women stay with women. Okay, that will be the interpretation. But you could have more mixity. So when lambda goes down, that means that mixity increases. Okay? Goes down from 1 to 0, mixity increases. And in that particular section, we were able to do it simply only for 2 values, but for the rest, we do with the continual values of E. So, but very importantly, if you want to have something interesting, you're going to assume that the low value of E is less than E star, and the high value of E is greater than E star, otherwise there's no big question. So you have a negative narrative and a positive narrative, and we assume a small cost of disclosure to undo indifference, to break the indifference. Okay? So you have interesting trade-off concerning disclosure. So you can ask yourself, who is most eager to spread positive narrative or refrain from spreading negative narrative? I-type is going to be more concerned about that, of course, because the I-type cares more about social welfare, and therefore will care more about the influence. And also, the I-type has less need for excuses because the I-type, from time to time, will actually choose a moral action. It's also easy to see that you have negative narrative are strategic substitutes because, if you spread a negative narrative, you would like the subsequent people not to do that, right? Whereas if you spread a positive narrative, you like subsequent people to spread it further to achieve the common good, even so you don't participate yourself to it. Okay? So we look at the equibia. And by the way, there's a region of where there are multiple equibia, as often in this case. Let me just emphasize the optimal mixity as a specific result. So what we show is that a greater degree of mixing between active and passive agents, a lower lambda, expands the range of parameters for which an equilibrium with small default action exists and raises the aggregate provision of the public good. So the expectation of in the population is this infinite population increases. Okay? So it's very interesting actually because the agents who are passive in the sense that again either they don't choose an action or the action is not observed, actually act as a firewall. So basically, passive agents always relay positive narratives. They don't need excuses, but they relay positive narratives. And at the same time, they stop their firewalls. They stop the negative narrative from spreading. The hear negative narratives they don't relate. So it's actually good to mix passive people with active people, because you stop the negative narratives, okay? So to come back to one of our examples, if you have a population in which social networks are more mixed in terms of men and women, actually the negative narrative like, women like that, that kind of negative narrative, actually they like flirting, and it's not harassment, blah, blah, blah. It's not spreading as fast if you have mixity. If you leave the men together, then it's bad, okay? Because they can, the narrative spreads very fast, and it's never stopped. So it's not never stopped, but it spreads quite a lot. So actually, what we say is that if you have a more mixed network, actually, it's good for social welfare, okay? And similarly, we said that the polarization of beliefs, if you have a more mixed network, you have less polarization of beliefs. Whereas if men stay together and women stay together, they get beliefs on how bad it is, how bad harassment is, which are more divergent. So. Okay, so let me just say a few words about narratives versus imperatives. We have a section also on looking for narratives, so looking for reason to act, looking for reason not to act, looking for excuses, and what kind of whether excuses are socially acceptable or not. Do you have excuses for excuses, in a sense? I'm not going to talk about that. And I just want to show you how we we formalize the imperative in this picture. So imperative will be basically cheap talk. It will be like Crawford Sobel, if you want, and tell you, don't kill, don't lie, okay? This is cheap talk. I'm not providing you with any argument or evidence for that. But as I'm going to show, imperatives don't live in a vacuum. Everybody is able to convey a narrative. Not everybody is able to influence actions through an imperative, okay? So think of that in a very simple way. Think about an imperative as saying A equals 1. You know, I'm not telling you why. I'm not giving you any argument for that. I'm saying don't lie, don't kill. Okay? What are the benefits of imperatives? They are less fragile, so they are less subject to interpretation uncertainty, which I haven't introduced yet. And then, of course, they are also cheaper to communicate. And they may allow, for any one of you who was used to Bayesian persuasion, by the way, they may allow to pull states in which the agent will be reluctant to behave well with other states where he will be eager to behave well. The cost of imperative is that it requires congruence. So that explains why parents or trusted religious leader might issue imperatives, whereas politicians, not quite, okay? Because they are not trusted as much. And of course, something which is well known is they are more rigid. So they say, don't lie, you know, the standard example of Kant, where you should open your door to someone who wants to kill your friend because this person is asking, is your friend around? And you know, don't lie. Of course, my friend is around. Please kill him. You know, there's, of course, with imperative, you don't have much adjustment to the knowledge you have about the particular situation. So that's something we formalize. But let me just show you how easy it is to. So we are going just to assume that there is a principle, and the principle has two modes of communication. He has a narrative, so he knows the value of E, for example, and he can also have an imperative. He can use both the narrative or the imperative, or he can use one or none. How does this principle communicate? Let's assume that the principle is more pro-social than the agent, for example. Maybe the principle might be society, maybe it's parents or religious leader. It could be the externcy itself also, by the way. But, and you know, whether you're more pro-social will depend on hyperbolicity and self-control, image concern, many things, okay? But let's take this example. So basically, the principle would like the agent to behave whenever the externality is greater than EP, where the agent will behave well only if the externality is greater than E star, and EP is less than E star, okay? So that means the principle is more prone, actually, to would like the agent to behave well, even in situations where the agent doesn't want to. Okay? So let's stick that. So let's see. So the game is the following. The principal is going to choose between disclosing the narrative E, which now is a number between 0 and 1, and issuing an imperative and just say A equals 1. Okay? So an effective imperative is one that induces a probability of prosocial behavior. And basically, when does it exist? Okay? The first thing is the principal must be willing to actually recommend A equals 1. So that means that it must be the case that E is greater than EP, right? By definition. So the principal is willing to recommend good behavior only if the externality is big enough, greater than EP. But then you need an obedience, just like any cheap talk model. You need an obedience condition where the agent is going to pick A equals 1 if and only if basically the posterior mean of E conditional on recommendation by the principal is greater than E star. Now, you know that the principal recommend to choose A equals 1 if E is greater than EP, by definition, because EP is where the principal is indifferent. So that means that the truncated mean M plus of EP must be greater than E star. From that, you already see that it must be the case that there is enough congruence between the principal and the agent for the agent to obey the order. It's a very standard result in chip-toll games, but it has an implication which is kind of appealing here. Okay? And from there, you can derive a number of results about when is that the channel of communication is going to be through an imperative, when is that it's going to be through a narrative. And actually, in this model, as it stands, it's only one of the channels. But there are more complicated models in which it's more complex. So, for example, if you look at religion, very often it starts with a little narrative. It just has to raise your posterior beliefs to the point to which you can issue an imperative. So often it starts with a narrative and then it moves on to an imperative once you have built enough trust in the recommendation. Okay? So it's actually a pretty rich thing. And there are many things you can do. You can see what happens if the cost of rigidity of imperatives and how it changes things and so on. So let me conclude. Yes, let me conclude. So there's a lot more work to be done. One is, which I find fascinating, is what happens in organization, because we know that our moral behavior depends very much on whether we are by ourselves or in groups. And by the way, our groups, being in a group often absolves us from our moral behavior because it's collective responsibility, even when we're actually pivotal. And this actually gets back to more rigor room, is that even we are actually pivotal, we find excuses that we are not pivotal to misbehave. And it's something that immoral entrepreneurs actually use very effectively in practice. That will be interesting. So, that kind of thing. What about a moral act? Okay, so here it's very simple. It's an externality. So I pollute, I do something bad to you. That's very simple. But what about I give you an opinion which is opposite to yours? Is that a negative externality on yours, right? Do I shed bad light on your reasoning, or, it's more complex. What about acts that may create a positive and a negative externality? So I close a plant, I fire workers, but this plant was polluting, so I reduce pollution. Okay? What happens to that? Now, I also told you that it doesn't matter whether the narrative is right or wrong for that theory. What matters is that it has some persuasion power for whatever reason. It might be actually very informative, or it might just be misleading. It doesn't matter for the theory. But in practice, we want to go deeper, especially for normative purposes. We want to go deeper into all those cognitive biases and those fake narratives, those fake news and the like, which are very important. Identity conflict and many other things. And we have a companion paper we're also finishing, also with Roland and Armin, on trying to measure willingness to pay for public goods and to correct contingent valuations. What we measure in experiments, in field experiments or lab experiments, is not the willingness to pay. For good reason. For one thing, there are image concerns. So when people answer those questions, they also try to impress their audience or impress themselves, think they are good people. And that introduces a bias, and it's going to inflate the willingness to pay. And it's going to inflate the willingness to pay both under the direct elicitation method and the Baker-de Groot-Marchak method. So if you're not familiar with this, the direct elicitation method is I go and see Francine. I said, I give you $50 and you let me speak half an hour more. do you do it? Yeah, A equals 1 or A equals 0. She knows it's immoral and she should not take the $50, but okay. Then I can measure, and I measure by varying across people or across situation, $50, $20, $10, whatever. The BDM or Becker-de-Groot-Marchak method is more parsimonious in the sense that I just go and see Francine. I said, look, how much do you want, right? So at what point will you start taking my offer? Okay, 0, 1, $100, right? And Francine answers $20, okay? So $20, right? It's a method. No, she would never. She's Kantian. She would never do that. So you basically ask for a threshold, and they give you different answers. They both inflate the willingness to pay, the willingness to accept, but because of image concern, but they give you different answer. So actually, for low mu, for low image concern, actually the direct elicitation method inflates more, and for high image concern, with BDM, you're always Kantian. So you say, I'm not going to. So the way it works, by the way, I'm sorry, I missed that. In BDM, typical experiment, I will go to Francine, I will say, will you take 1, 2, 3, $100? And the outcome will be drawn. Tell me now, but then the outcome will be drawn with a uniform distribution on 100. Okay? So Francine, before saying I'm going to accept 100, has to think that she will get it only with probability 1 over 100, with a small probability. But our reputation will be spoiled anyway, right? Because if she accepts 100, her reputation goes down the drain. Even so, she will get 100 only with probability 1%. So that's the important thing, which explains that people can behave in a they're completely consequentialist, but they can behave in a very Kantian way in those experiments, which means that I'm not going to take the money no matter what, because it's cheap signaling, right? There's only probability 1% that you get any given valuation, right? So is that worse, actually, accepting 100 with probability 1% than to destroy your reputation with probability 100%, right? That's the kind of reasoning. So you get lots of Kantian behavior. I'm not saying Kantians do not exist, but that kind of elicitation method gives rise to a lot of moral posturing. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I want to say. And thank you very much. So Francine said 10 minutes for questions.
Where do jokes fit into this?
Jokes. Jokes with a moral component, you mean?
Yes.
That's a good question. You can. Jokes may not be jokes, right? So they may also contain a grain of truth, or at least something that you mean. So you might think of some jokes, not all of them, of course, but as narratives as well, right? They convey some position, and they can be actually quite powerful sometimes. So they might be included. I've never thought about that, to be honest, but they may be included also sometimes as narratives. And I'm afraid often negative narratives, right?
Yet another question. Where does leading by example fit in order to induce moral behavior? Leading by example.
Okay, so
do as I do.
So we actually have that also in the model. So for example, in the virality model, so you observe the behavior of the previous person, and so if you see the previous person behaving morally, there's some leading by example too, because you infer something about this person's opinion about, you observe something about whether this person is pro-social, but also you infer also something about what the person knows. In an extension of that, which is not in the paper, you could also, the more congruent the person is, of course, you will be leading more by example, but then it will be like in the economics literature on leading by example, right? You follow people you trust, basically, also on that front. So the action itself is also a message which is a positive narrative if it's equals one. Yeah.
No? Okay. Thank you. Okay, I do. My question refers to the...
Sorry, your name. Sorry. There's a new rule. Your name.
Jens Prüfer, Tilburg University. My question refers to the imperatives model, and I was a little bit struck that there's no institutions in the imperatives model. So there is, I mean, it is super interesting. It is what Dixit calls a first-party system. So where the morality of one individual is important for the actions. But what I was missing, or what I was looking for a little bit, is like the credibility of the speaker, which would be the principal in your situation, does not depend on any social structure. It does not depend on the background of the speaker. For instance, if I understand correctly, in your model, the speaker could be either a democratically elected leader who has a lot of legitimacy, or it could be the random person from the street, but it would not affect the probability with which the imperative of the speaker is taken for granted.
No, I mean, it's implicit in a sense, which is that the congruence is going to depend on the cultural environment, on the past behavior of the principal, right? So if you have a leader you don't trust, the imperatives are not going to work. Maybe narratives might have some effect, but not the imperatives. So it's implicit. It's not formalized here, but it's part of the trust you have. For example, the parameter I called EP is really the trust you have in the person. So if you have someone who is too remote from your own taste, either someone who is a saint, right, and you say, I don't want to listen to that person because I'm never going to, those are not my moral standard, or someone who actually is very moral is not going to have any influence. It's only when you are close enough to the agent that you are going to have an influence. So I think it's included. Well, your concern is actually included in the model, but in an implicit form.
Sorry. Okay, I would take the final question. Sorry. Hans Tong from Taiwan National. So I was kind of wondering if the people's perceptions of social inequality might affect the effects of narratives or imperatives. We ran experiments on people's pro-social behavior for redistributive politics, and we found that their perceptions of inequality, the shape of inequality, the structure of inequality might affect the contribution in a public goods context. So I was wondering if, in your theory, that kind of social perceptions would also affect the results.
Well, it would be interesting in your experiment to know what channel actually influenced the behavior of people. Is that they change their views on equality, change their views on the effect of the intervention? Or?
So we divide people into several groups with different composition of rich and poor people. And then we, of course, we manipulate, first of all, which group they're assigned to. And second, we also differentiate between, sometimes we allow people to know their actual status in that group, and sometimes we don't allow them to know that. And we found the differences, do affect their level of contributions.
I would be interested in also, maybe that's not the right place to discuss this, but one of our arguments is that the mixity stuff, the silo mentality, actually plays a role in our theory now. Whether it's actually validated empirically, I will, of course, hope so. No, but at least know whether it's right or wrong.
And we're going to run neuroscientific experiments later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
so.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for this nice discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.